Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful philosophy for sound design and C sound that kind of turns complexity right on its head. We're going to look at how to build these rich, dynamic, and unpredictable sounds, not by adding more controls, but by taking them away. Let's see how less can actually be way, way more. So, have you ever opened up a sound design project and just felt completely lost? You know the feeling. You've got this incredible idea for a sound in your head, but to get there, you're faced with tweaking dozens of different knobs and numbers for every single note. It can feel a lot more like you're doing data entry than actually making music. And yeah, in a C-sound score, that feeling often looks just like this long, intimidating line of numbers just to define one single sound event. You tweak one thing, and suddenly you might have to change 10 others. Now, it's powerful for sure, but it can also be a huge roadblock to your creativity and just getting into a flow. So what if there was a better way? Well, there is, and it's this incredibly elegant philosophy that completely shifts our focus. We move away from micromanaging every tiny detail, and instead we start designing smart, responsive instruments that really feel like they have a life of their own. Let's get into it. The core idea here is called 5-parameter instrument design. So instead of your score file having to tell an instrument every little thing it needs to do, you only give it the absolute bare essentials. All the other interesting stuff, the texture, the timbre, those subtle little variations, all of that gets generated from within the instrument itself, based on just a few simple instructions. And here they are. These are the only 5 parameters you really need to worry about in your score. You've got your instrument number, start time, duration, amplitude, and frequency. That's it. These are the fundamental building blocks, and because everything else is going to be derived from them, your score becomes incredibly clean, simple, and so much easier to read. And this quote really gets to the heart of the matter. It encourages self-contained and dynamic instrument behaviors. In other words, you're not just triggering static, boring sounds anymore. You're creating instruments that can react, evolve, and maybe even surprise you. A great way to think about this is like musical DNA. Those 5 parameters, they're the simple genetic code, but it's the instrument's internal logic, the code you write inside the instrument, that determines how that DNA actually expresses itself. The very same 5 inputs can create this huge variety of sonic offspring, just by changing the internal rules. So, how does this actually work in practice, right? How do we get all that rich detail from just 5 inputs? Well, the secret lies in using those inputs to drive internal processes, especially what we can call virtual randomness. This right here is where the magic happens. We start creating these powerful hidden links between parameters. So, for example, the amplitude, P4, doesn't have to just control volume. Internally, we can tell it to also control, say, the number of harmonics. So a louder note could automatically sound brighter and richer. A higher frequency note could have a slightly different filter setting. The parameters all become interconnected. Let's take a real-world example, like the buzz opcode, which is great for creating sounds with lots of harmonics. Now, the old way would be to manually add another P field to your score just for the number of harmonics for every note. The smarter way, we just tell the instrument, hey, the louder this note is, the more harmonics I want you to generate. The complexity just happens on its own. And this works for timbre too, not just brightness. Let's look at a resonant filter. Instead of manually setting the resonance for every single note, we can tie it to amplitude. Imagine playing a synth where the harder you hit the key, the more intense and peaky that filter sounds. That's the exact kind of expressive, dynamic behavior we're talking about designing. Okay, so you're probably wondering, this all sounds great, but what are the actual tools for this? What do I use? So let's look at the C-sound opcodes that are really the engine for all this internal magic. Here's your starter kit. These opcodes here are all designed to generate random or pseudo-random values. You can use them inside your instrument to add these subtle or, not so subtle variations to things like filter cutoff or decay time or stereo position. This is the stuff that makes your instrument feel alive and prevents it from sounding robotic and repetitive. And you can get even more sophisticated. By using some simple conditional logic, like if-else statements, you can design instruments that literally make their own decisions. For example, if the note's frequency is above middle C, add a little bit of extra delay. Or if the amplitude is really low, make the attack time a little slower. You're programming behaviors, not just setting parameters. So after all this, what's the big payoff? Why should you even bother adopting this design philosophy? Well, it really comes down to shifting your creative focus in a really profound way. The benefits are huge. Your scores become so much simpler and more focused on the actual music. Your instruments take on a life of their own, becoming dynamic and responsive. But most importantly, you stop thinking like a data entry clerk and you start thinking like a true instrument designer, focused on behavior and interaction. You're building a system that generates music, not just a list of notes. And that leaves us with a final thought. By intentionally limiting ourselves to just those 5 parameters, we force ourselves to be way more creative with the instrument's internal logic. It really proves that constraints can be an incredibly powerful tool. So the question is, what could you create if your limits became your greatest creative strength?